Dad, you do this and you're dead to us. I mean it. That was my son, Joseph, 34 years old, standing in my kitchen in Calgary on a Tuesday afternoon, pointing at me like I was a tenant who'd missed rent. Not congratulations, not I'm happy for you, just that, delivered flat, like he'd rehearsed it in the car on the way over. I set my coffee mug down on the counter, slow, deliberate, the same counter where I'd made his school lunches for 12 years, ham and mustard, crusts off until he was 9, on until he was 12, off again in high school because apparently crusts were embarrassing. "You done?" I said. He blinked, wasn't expecting that. "My name is Clement Clark. I'm 62 years old. I spent 28 years married to a woman named Diane, built a life in the Beltline neighborhood of Calgary, raised 2 kids in a house that still has a growth chart penciled inside the pantry door. Diane and I split 6 years ago, quietly, without lawyers, without drama. We were better apart than together, and we both knew it. I kept the house, she moved to Kelowna. We still talk at Christmas. I didn't fall apart after the divorce, but I went quiet. That's the honest word for it. I went quiet for a long time. I met Ramona 14 months ago at a grief support group at the Unitarian Church on 16th Avenue. She wasn't there for a divorce. She'd lost her husband, Gerald, to a heart attack 3 winters before. She had silver-streaked hair and this way of listening, really listening, like what you said actually landed somewhere inside her instead of just bouncing off. We got coffee after the 3rd session, then dinner, then long walks along the Bow River through October and November, even when the wind cut right through you and your breath came out in clouds. She never asked me to be anything, never needed fixing or financing. She just wanted company, honest company. By spring, I knew. I proposed in April on the walking bridge near Prince's Island Park. She laughed and covered her mouth and said yes before I'd even gotten back off my knee. I called Joseph that same evening. He didn't say a word for 9 full seconds. I counted. Then, "How long have you even known her?" "Over a year." That's nothing, Dad." And then he drove over uninvited, walked in with his jaw already set, and told me in my own kitchen, in my own house, that I would be dead to him if I married this woman. I looked at my son, this man I coached in hockey, drove to university in Edmonton, co-signed an apartment lease for when his credit was a disaster at 26, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not hurt, clarity. Because here's what I hadn't told Joseph yet. Here's what I'd been turning over in my mind for 3 weeks before I ever called him. The last 4 years since the divorce, Joseph and Hadley had been treating this house like a hotel they didn't have to pay for. Weekend stays when they were between places, my truck borrowed so many times I started keeping a log, money lent, and I use that word loosely because none of it ever came back, $43,000 over 4 years. I know because I wrote every single amount in a notebook I keep in my desk drawer. I never said anything because he was my son, because I thought this is what you do for family. But standing there in that kitchen, watching him threaten me over the one good thing that had happened to me in years, I understood something finally. This was never about love. This was about the house, the pension, the RRSP, what he thought he was owed when I was gone. "Joseph," I said, and my voice was quieter than I felt, "I think you should go home." "Dad, go home." He left, slammed the door hard enough to rattle the window above the sink. I stood there in the silence. Outside, a Chinook wind was coming in off the Rockies, that warm, impossible wind that can flip Calgary from winter to spring in an afternoon. I could feel it pressing against the glass. I picked up my phone and called a number I'd gotten from a friend 2 months ago, a lawyer, Christine O'Coffer, family and estate law, downtown Calgary. She answered on the second ring. "Miss O'Coffer," I said, "my name is Clement Clark. I think I need to come in." She fit me in for Thursday, and what she told me when I sat across that desk from her, that changed everything. If you've ever been the person everyone leans on until the moment you finally choose yourself and suddenly you're the villain, you need to hear what happened next.
Christine Ogaffar's office was on the 14th floor of a glass tower on 8th Avenue SW. The kind of office where everything is clean and nothing is soft. I sat across from her with a worn spiral notebook in my hands and felt slightly ridiculous, like a man who'd shown up to a hospital with a bandage he'd tied himself. She was maybe 40, sharp eyes, no small talk. "Walk me through it," she said. So I did. I opened the notebook and I started reading, not dramatically, just the facts, the way I'd written them down. October, 2 years ago. Joseph and Hadley stay for 11 days while their rental falls through. I buy groceries the entire time, $380. January. Joseph borrows the truck for a long weekend to move some furniture for a friend. Returns it with a cracked side mirror and a quarter tank of gas. Never mentions it. March. Dad, can you spot us rent this month? Hadley's between contracts. $2,000. E-transferred that same night because he sounded desperate, and I am his father, and that's what fathers do. I kept reading. Christine kept writing. By the time I reached the last page, the number on the table between us was $43,200. 4 years, not counting the truck repairs I paid myself, not counting the groceries I stopped logging after the first year because it felt petty. Christine set her pen down. Has he ever signed anything, any acknowledgement of debt? No. Has he ever offered to pay any of it back? I almost laughed. He thanks me sometimes, if that counts. She looked at me steadily. Mr. Clark, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. When you called, you said you were getting married. Is that what this is about? Protecting your assets going forward? Partly, I said, but there's something else. I told her about the phone call from Joseph the night I got engaged, the threat, the kitchen confrontation, the way he'd stood in my house and told me I would be dead to him if I married Ramona. She didn't flinch. She'd heard worse, I could tell. Does your son know what's in your will currently? I haven't updated it since the divorce. It's vague. He probably assumes he gets everything. Does he have access to any of your accounts? And that's when I stopped, because I remembered something that felt small at the time, forgettable, the kind of thing you wave away because it's your kid and you trust your kid. 18 months ago, Joseph had asked me to add him to my checking account, just as an emergency contact, he'd said, in case something happens to you, Dad, so we don't have to go through probate for basic stuff. It sounded reasonable, responsible even. I said yes at the bank without blinking. I told Christine this. She wrote it down without changing her expression, but something shifted in the room. How often do you check that account? Monthly, maybe? I'm not obsessive about it. I'd like you to pull up your last 6 months of statements, right now if you have your phone. I did. We sat there together in that clean, quiet office while I scrolled, and I started seeing things I hadn't looked at closely enough. Small transfers, $60, $120, $240, never large enough to alarm, always just under the threshold where your eye snags on it. 19 transactions over 6 months, $3,460. I hadn't authorized a single one. The room felt very still. Mr. Clark, she said carefully, in Alberta, what your son has done may constitute unauthorized use of a financial account. That's not a civil matter. That's potentially criminal. I heard the words, processed them slowly, the way you process something you already knew but weren't ready to name. My son had been stealing from me, not borrowing, not asking and being given, taking, quietly, steadily, betting I wouldn't notice. What do I do? I asked. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. Christine folded her hands on the desk. First, we freeze the access, today. Then we document everything in that notebook properly. Dates, amounts, a statutory declaration. And then, Mr. Clark, we rewrite your will, completely, before the wedding, because if Joseph finds out you're doing this and he moves first. She stopped. What? I said. She looked at me directly. He may try to have you declared incapable of making financial decisions. It happens more than people think. Adult children, contested estates. If he gets there first with the right doctor and the right paperwork. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I gripped that notebook in my lap and thought about my son standing in my kitchen, the way he'd pointed at me, the rehearsed certainty of it. He'd already been planning this long before Ramona, long before the proposal. I just hadn't been watching. I walked out of that office onto 8th Avenue and called Ramona. She answered on the first ring. I told her everything. She didn't panic. She didn't cry. She said 4 words that I have thought about every day since. Are you okay, Clement? Not, what does this mean for us? Not, should we call off the wedding? Just that. Are you okay? And that's when I knew with absolute certainty that I was marrying the right person and that my son was about to find out exactly who his father was.
She's manipulating you, Dad. Can't you see that? You're 62 years old and some woman you met at a church group has you throwing away your family. Joseph again, this time on the phone, 4 days after my meeting with Christine. I was sitting in Ramona's kitchen in Varsity, Northwest Calgary, drinking tea I didn't taste. Ramona was in the next room, giving me space without being asked. That's the thing about her. She reads a room without making it about herself. Joseph, I said, I need you to stop talking and listen to me. Silence. I know about the transfers. More silence, a different kind. What transfers? And there it was, that half-second delay, that tiny recalibration. If he didn't know exactly what I meant, he would have said, "What are you talking about?" Instead, he said, "What transfers?" Past tense, specific, like a man trying to figure out how much I knew before he decided what to admit. 19 of them, 6 months, $3,464, out of the account you told me you needed access to for emergencies. Nothing. Joseph. Dad, I was going to pay that back. Don't. My voice came out hard, harder than I planned. Don't do that. Don't stand there and tell me you were going to pay back money you took without asking from a man who has never once said no to you, not once in 34 years. I heard him breathe, heard Hadley's voice somewhere in the background, low and urgent, asking him something. We needed it, he finally said. And there was something in his tone, not guilt, not shame, but a kind of flat entitlement that hit me worse than anger would have. Like it was reasonable, like I should understand. For what? I asked. Things have been tight, you know that. I know that you told me that. I also know you took a week in Mexico in November. I saw the photos on Hadley's Facebook. Silence again. That was partially paid for by... I don't want the explanation, Joseph. I stood up from Ramona's kitchen table and walked to the window. Outside, the May sky over Calgary was doing that thing it does. Half cloud, half impossible blue, like the city can't make its mind. The Rockies were faint on the horizon, white-capped, indifferent. Here's what's happening, I said. I've removed you from the account. I've spoken to a lawyer, and I'm getting married to Ramona on June 14th, whether you come or not. You're serious? I've never been more serious about anything. Dad, his voice shifted, softer now. Calculated soft, the voice he used when he wanted something. I knew it from when he was 16, asking to borrow the car. You're making a mistake. This woman, she came out of nowhere. You're lonely, I get it. The divorce was hard, but this isn't you thinking clearly. Hadley and I are worried about you. We just want to protect you. I closed my eyes for a moment. Protect you. That word sitting right next to 19 unauthorized bank transfers. Joseph, I love you. I will always love you. But I need you to hear me clearly. What you've been doing, the money, the access, treating my house like a storage unit, treating me like a resource instead of a person, that ends now. All of it. So that's it. She says jump and you ask how high? This has nothing to do with Ramona. It has everything to do with her. No, I kept my voice level. This has to do with the fact that you stood in my kitchen and threatened me, your own father, and I let it pass because I thought maybe you were just scared. But you weren't scared, Joseph. You were calculating, and I missed it for 4 years because I didn't want to see it. He didn't answer. I'll be filing a statutory declaration with my lawyer this week. The transfers are documented. I haven't decided whether to take it further. That depends on you. You'd report your own son? I'd rather not. That's up to you. I heard him make a sound, half laugh, half something uglier. Hadley was right, he said. She said you'd do this. She said the moment you met someone, you'd forget about us, about the kids, about everything you promised. The kids, his kids, my grandchildren, Luca, who was 7, and small, serious Maya, who was 5 and recently decided that dinosaurs were the only topic worth discussing. He knew exactly where to press. I haven't forgotten anyone, I said quietly. Don't use Luca and Maya for this. They deserve better than that. He hung up. I stood at that window for a long time. The Rockies hadn't moved. The sky had made up its mind. Clouds now, gray and low, coming in fast from the west the way they do before a Calgary hailstorm. Ramona appeared in the doorway. She didn't ask how it went. She just looked at me and said, "Soup's on. Come sit." So I did. We ate. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. But that night, after I drove home to the Beltline, I found something taped to my front door. A handwritten note. Hadley's writing, not Joseph's. Clement, we need to meet. Just the two of us, without lawyers, without Ramona. There are things you don't know. About her. Things you need to hear before it's too late. Ended. Hadley. I read it twice. Standing on my own porch in the dark, the hail starting to tick against the roof. I told myself I wouldn't meet her. I told myself it was a manipulation, a last move on a board Joseph had been playing for years. But the next morning, Hadley called, and what she said made me stop cold.
She was engaged before, Clement. Did she tell you that? Did she tell you what happened to that man's estate after he died? Hadley's voice on the phone, controlled, precise, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this. We were supposed to meet in person. I'd agreed to coffee at a Tim Hortons on Crowchild Trail, neutral ground, public enough that nobody could claim anything. But she'd called before I even got my coat on. "I'm listening," I said, carefully. His name was Gerald, her late husband, but before Gerald, there was a man named Patrick Sewin, Vancouver. She was engaged to him in 2009. He died of a stroke 8 months into the engagement. She was listed as beneficiary on 2 of his accounts. I sat down on the edge of my bed. "Hadley, where are you getting this?" "I looked into her, Clement. Someone had to. You weren't going to." "That's not an answer." A pause. "A private investigator. Joseph hired him 6 weeks ago." 6 weeks ago. Before the kitchen confrontation, before the phone calls, before any of it. They'd been building a file on Ramona while I was picking out a ring. I felt something cold move through me. Not doubt about Ramona, something worse. The realization of how organized this had been, how long they'd been preparing. "Hadley," I said, "a man Ramona was engaged to died 15 years ago, and she was named on his accounts? That's what you have? There's more. Was there any investigation, any fraud finding, anything legal?"
Silence. Was there, Hadley? Not officially, but then what you're describing is a grieving woman who lost someone and was left something by a man who loved her. That's it. That's the whole story. You don't know that. And you don't know otherwise. You paid someone to dig through a widow's past, and that's the best you found? A 15-year-old engagement? Her composure cracked slightly. I could hear it, the small tightening in her throat. We're trying to protect you. There was that word again. Protect. Hadley, I said. I walked to the window. Same view I'd had for 6 years. The Bow River Trail below. Cyclists already out in the May morning. You and Joseph hired someone to investigate the woman I love before you ever sat across from her. You came to me with a story designed to make me afraid, not informed. And you did it while your husband was quietly draining my bank account. That's not fair. Which part? Nothing. I'm going to ask you one question, and I want you to think before you answer. If Ramona had no money, if I had no house, no pension, nothing to leave anyone, would you be making this phone call right now? The silence that followed was the longest of the conversation. It was also the only answer I needed. I'm going to the Tim Hortons. If you want to have a real conversation, not a strategy, not a performance, I'll be there for 30 minutes. But if you walk in with that file, with whatever your investigator put together, I'm leaving, and we won't speak again until Joseph and I have sorted out what he owes me. I hung up. I drove to Crowchild Trail, ordered a large coffee, sat by the window watching the traffic move. 34 minutes passed. Hadley never came. I drove from there straight to Christine O'Coffer's office. She wasn't expecting me, but she fit me in between appointments, the way good lawyers do when they can hear something has shifted. I told her everything, the investigator, Patrick Sewin, the phone call. Christine listened without writing anything down, which told me she was thinking hard. When I finished, she said, "This is actually useful." How? Because it tells us they're scared. People who are confident they'll inherit don't hire private investigators, they wait. The fact that they went looking for something to use against Ramona means they already know the will isn't guaranteed. She leaned forward. Clement, I need to ask you something I should have asked you at our first meeting. Do you have a memorandum of wishes, something in your own words, dated and witnessed, explaining your state of mind, your reasons for your decisions? No. We're writing one today, right now before we do anything else. What does it do? It makes it nearly impossible for anyone to claim later that you were manipulated or mentally unfit. It's you, in your own words, sane and clear and deliberate, explaining exactly why you're making the choices you're making. She pulled out a legal pad. Alberta courts give significant weight to these documents. If Joseph tries to challenge the will, and I think he will, this is what stops him. I picked up the pen she slid across the desk, and I started writing. I wrote about Diane, about the divorce and what it cost me emotionally, not financially. The 6 quiet years after, the loneliness becomes the temperature you forget you're living in. I wrote about the Bow River in October, breath in clouds, and what it felt like to want a future again, instead of just a routine. I wrote about Joseph, not with anger, with honesty. The loans, the truck, the transfers, the threat in my kitchen. I wrote that I loved my son. I wrote that love and accountability were not opposites. I wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. When I finished, Christine read it, all of it. She didn't rush. Then she looked up. "This is good, Clement. This is really good. We'll have it witnessed and notarized this afternoon." She paused. "One more thing. Your grandchildren, Luca and Maya,
What do you want for them?" I hadn't let myself think about them clearly, because thinking about them clearly meant admitting Joseph might use them, that the children had already been placed, without knowing it, directly between us. They keep whatever I set aside for them, irrevocable. Joseph can't touch it, can't redirect it, can't use it as leverage. It goes directly to them at 25. Christine nodded and wrote it down. I walked out of that office into a warm Calgary afternoon, the kind where the city looks freshly washed, and I called Ramona. "How'd it go?" she asked. I told Christine about Patrick. A beat. Then, "I was going to tell you about Patrick. I didn't know how to bring it up without it sounding like I was defending myself against something you hadn't accused me of yet." "You don't have to defend yourself to me." "I know." Her voice was quiet. "That's why I was going to tell you." We stayed on the phone without talking for a moment, just the sound of each other breathing. Then she said, "Joseph called me this morning." I stopped walking. "He called you?" "Yes. He was calm, polite even. He said he just wanted to introduce himself. But Clement," she paused, "he knew things about my schedule, where I park, what gym I use." The investigator, still watching. "Ramona." "I'm not scared," she said, but her voice had changed. Something careful had entered it. "I just think you should know your son is not done yet." He wasn't. 3 days before the wedding, Joseph made his final move, and it had nothing to do with lawyers or money or private investigators. It had to do with Luca.
Grandpa, Dad says you don't love us anymore. He says that's why you're sending us away. 7 years old, Luca, on my doorstep in the Beltline at 6:40 on a Thursday evening, 3 days before my wedding. Alone. Joseph's car already pulling away from the curb before I'd even gotten the door fully open. I looked down at my grandson, Spider-Man backpack, one shoe untied, eyes working hard to be brave. "Come inside, bud," I said. I took him to the kitchen, made him a grilled cheese because it was the only thing I knew he'd eat without negotiation, sat across from him while he picked at the crust and looked at the table. "Your dad dropped you off without calling," I said, gentle, careful. Luca nodded. "Did he tell you why?" "He said you'd explain." He looked up. "Are you sending us away, Grandpa?" I felt something move through my chest, slow and heavy, like a door closing on something you'd been trying to keep open. This was the move. Not lawyers, not investigators, not Hadley and her private file. This, a 7-year-old boy sitting in my kitchen being used as a message. "See what you're doing to your family, Clement? See what it costs?" "Luca," I said, "look at me." He did. "I am not sending you anywhere. I love you and Maya more than I can explain in words. That has not changed. That will never change, okay?" He studied my face the way kids do when they're deciding whether to believe you. Then he nodded, picked up his grilled cheese, started eating. I stepped into the hallway and called Joseph, straight to voicemail. Called Hadley, same. I stood there in my own hallway, phone in hand, understanding with complete clarity what had just happened. Joseph had dropped his 7-year-old son on my doorstep unannounced, no overnight bag beyond a backpack, no explanation, no answer to my calls, because he wanted me rattled. He wanted Luca to be the argument he couldn't make himself. I called Christine. She answered on the second ring. I told her what happened. "Don't move him. Don't take him back to their house tonight. If Joseph left him with you deliberately and isn't answering calls, document the time, document your attempts to reach them, and keep Luca comfortable. This could be, and I want you to hear this clearly, this could be the worst thing Joseph has done yet. Depending on what he tells a family court, leaving a child without notice or communication." He wouldn't claim I took him. A pause. Clement, I need you to stop assuming limits your son won't cross. 3 weeks ago, you didn't think he'd investigate Ramona. A month before that, you didn't think he was stealing from your account. Stop predicting what he won't do. She was right. I knew she was right. I called Ramona next. She was at my door in 20 minutes, an overnight bag of groceries in each hand, as if she'd already anticipated staying. Luca looked up from the couch where he'd been watching television and stared at her with the focused suspicion only a 7-year-old can produce. "You must be Luca," she said. She didn't push it, didn't crouch down to his level and perform warmth, just said it matter-of-factly and went to put the groceries away. Luca watched her move around my kitchen for a while. Then, quietly, without any preamble, he said, "Dad says she's stealing you." Ramona stopped. Her back was to him. I watched her take one breath. Then she turned around, leaned against the counter, and looked at him directly. "What do you think?" she said. Luca frowned. "I don't know. You brought food." Ramona nodded seriously. "That's a fair point." He almost smiled, caught himself. Joseph called at 9:47 that night. I let it ring. He called again at 10:15. I answered. "I'll pick him up in the morning." No apology, no explanation, like he'd lent me a library book. "Joseph, you left your son on my doorstep without a phone call, without a bag, without answering when I called you back. I knew he'd be fine with you." "That's not the point." "Look, I needed some time." "To do what?" I asked, "because Christine tells me what you did tonight has a name in Alberta family law. Are you aware of that?" Silence. "I'm not threatening you, but I need you to understand something. I have been patient. I have absorbed things from you that I should have pushed back on years ago, but you put your son in the middle of this tonight. Luca, 7 years old, you told him, 'I don't love you anymore.' You used your own child as a weapon against his grandfather 3 days before his wedding." "Nothing. If you ever do anything like that again, I will not hesitate. Do you understand me?" A long pause. "The wedding's really happening?" His voice had changed. The strategy was gone. What was left underneath sounded young and lost and almost like my son. "Yes," I said, "it is." "I don't understand why you need this. You have family. You have us." And there was the real thing, finally. Underneath the threats, the transfers, the investigator, the note on the door, the child left on the step, underneath it all was something I recognized, something I should have seen sooner. Joseph was afraid, not of losing money, not of losing an inheritance. He was afraid of losing me, of being replaced, of watching his father choose a future that didn't have him at the center. He'd responded to that fear the worst possible way, but the fear itself, that was real. "Joseph," I said, "I am not choosing Ramona instead of you. I am choosing both. I want both, but you have to let me." He didn't answer. "Come to the wedding," I said. "Bring Hadley, bring the kids, let Luca eat cake and run around and meet Ramona on his own terms. Just come." The line was quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. Then, "I'll think about it." It wasn't yes, but it wasn't the door slamming. I went back to the living room. Luca was asleep on the couch, head tipped back, mouth open, Spider-Man backpack still on because he'd refused to take it off. Ramona had draped a blanket over him and was sitting in the armchair across the room, reading, giving him space even in sleep. I sat beside her. She looked up. "He said he'll think about it," I told her. She nodded slowly, went back to her book. Outside, Calgary was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a long day of wind when the city finally exhales. I sat there in the lamplight, watching my grandson sleep, and thought about how much had happened in 3 weeks, how much I'd been carrying for years without knowing I was carrying it. And I thought,
Whatever happened Sunday, I am not the same man who stood in that kitchen and said, "I see," and swallowed it whole. That man is gone. Sunday came. I stood at the front of a small room at the courthouse on McLeod Trail in a dark blue suit Ramona had helped me pick out. Christine was there. Ramona's sister flew in from Saskatoon. And at 11:53, 2 minutes before we were due to start, the door opened.
Joseph walked in first, then Hadley, then Luca, pulling Maya by the hand. Maya, who was wearing a dress with dinosaurs on it, because of course she was. I didn't move, couldn't for a moment. Luca spotted me and crossed the room fast, the way kids do when they've decided something, and wrapped both arms around my waist without saying a word. I put my hand on the back of his head and looked up at my son standing in the doorway of a Calgary courthouse, in a shirt he'd clearly ironed in a hurry, collar slightly crooked, and I felt something crack open in my chest that I hadn't known was sealed shut. Joseph met my eyes, gave me one short nod. That was it. No speech, no apology. Just, he came. He showed up. I decided in that moment it was enough. Not because it erased anything, it didn't, but because some doors, if you let them close all the way, never open again. And I have seen enough of this life to know that the people still standing in the room deserve more weight than the ones who've already left. The ceremony was 20 minutes. A commissioner named Dale, who had the calm warmth of someone who has watched people choose each other hundreds of times and still means it every time. Ramona wore deep burgundy. She held my hands and looked at me the way she'd looked at me that first night at the grief group, like I was someone worth paying attention to. When Dale said, "You may kiss your bride," Luca made a noise of theatrical disgust that broke the whole room into laughter. Even Hadley laughed, even Joseph. We ate at a restaurant on 17th Avenue afterward. A long table, mismatched people learning each other's edges. Christine sat next to Ramona's sister, and they talked for 2 hours about things I couldn't hear, and both seemed to enjoy enormously. Maya showed Joseph her dinosaur dress with complete seriousness and informed him that the one on the hem was a parasaurus, and most people got it wrong. Joseph nodded gravely and said he'd remember that. I watched him with her, watched him be a father, easy and present, and thought, that is the man I raised. That is the one I want back. The other version, the calculating, frightened, grasping version, that one was made by fear, and I have to believe it can be unmade. We didn't talk about the money that night. We didn't talk about the will, the investigation, the transfers, any of it. There would be time for that. Christine had made sure the legal architecture was solid, the will rewritten, the memorandum witnessed, the grandchildren's trust irrevocable and clean. Whatever happened next, the foundation was poured and set. What we talked about was Ireland. Ramona and I were booked for September. 2 weeks, starting in Dublin, working our way west toward Connemara. Joseph asked about it with something that looked genuinely like interest. Hadley asked Ramona where she'd recommend staying. Ramona pulled up photos on her phone and slid it across the table. Small things, careful things, but things. 3 weeks after the wedding, Joseph came to my house alone. No Hadley, no kids. He sat at my kitchen table, the same room where he'd pointed at me and issued his ultimatum, and he put an envelope down between us. Inside was a check, not for $43,000, not even close, $4,000, with a note in his handwriting. First installment. I know it doesn't fix it. J. I looked at it for a long time. I thought about tearing it up, thought about telling him to keep it, that money wasn't the point, but that would have been its own kind of dishonesty, because money had been very much the point, and pretending otherwise would have let him off the hook he needed to feel. "Thank you," I said. He nodded, looked at the table. I talked to someone, a counselor. Hadley and I both did. A few sessions. He rubbed the back of his neck.
She asked me when I started thinking of you as a, she used the word resource. I didn't have an answer. I waited. I think it was after the divorce, when you and Mom split, and suddenly the house, everything, it felt like it could just disappear, go somewhere. And I think I started holding on before I even realized I was doing it. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years, maybe ever. "Joseph," I said, "the house is mine. The pension is mine. What I leave behind when I go is mine to decide. That's not cruelty. That's just how it works. I know. But I want you in my life, genuinely, not as a beneficiary, as my son." He looked up. His eyes were red at the edges, in the way men get when they're holding something too big to hold much longer. "Yeah," he said roughly, "I want that too." We didn't hug. We're not built that way, either of us. But when he left, he shook my hand and held it a beat longer than necessary, and I counted that. 6 months on from that courthouse on McLeod Trail, this is what my life looks like. Ramona and I drink coffee on the back deck every morning before the city wakes up. Calgary in autumn is extraordinary. The aspens go in gold along the river valley, the Rockies sharp and white on the horizon, the air so clean it almost hurts. I'm going to Ireland in 3 weeks, and I've already packed twice. Christine called last month. Joseph's lawyer had formally withdrawn any indication of a will challenge. No explanation filed. Christine said she wasn't surprised. I thanked her for everything. She said, "That's what I'm here for, but don't call me again for at least a decade." Luca and Maya come over every other Saturday. Ramona has taught Luca to play chess badly and enthusiastically. Maya has taught Ramona the correct names of 47 dinosaurs with an accuracy I find both impressive and slightly terrifying. I make grilled cheese. Nobody complains. Joseph and I are not where we were. I don't know if we'll ever get there, to that version of father and son that existed before fear and money got between us. But we are somewhere. We are in contact. We are trying. Some Sundays he calls just to talk, not to ask for anything. And those calls feel like something being rebuilt one plank at a time. Hadley is still guarded with me. That's fine. I'm patient. I think about who I was 18 months ago. A man who gone quiet. A man who filled his emptiness by making himself endlessly useful to people who had stopped seeing him as a person. A man who thought love meant absorbing whatever was aimed at him and calling it family. I don't think that anymore. I think love is supposed to be mutual. I think boundaries are not punishment. They are information. I think you can love your children completely and still refuse to be diminished by them. I think it is possible at 62, standing in a courthouse in Calgary, in a suit your wife helped you pick, to choose yourself for the first time in years and not be sorry for it. Christine says the memorandum I wrote in her office that afternoon is the best one she's kept on file, not because of the legal language, because of the 40 minutes of truth. She said, "Clement, you knew exactly who you were. You just needed to write it down." She wasn't wrong. I'm Clement Clark. I am 62 years old. I live in the Beltline in Calgary with my wife, Ramona, who laughs like she means it, who brought groceries without being asked, who said, "Are you okay?" before she said anything else. I have a son I'm still fighting to know again. I have grandchildren who make everything worth it. I have a lawyer I hope to never need again. I have a friend named Christine who kept me from losing everything to the story someone else was writing about my life. And I have this, finally, at 62, the unshakable knowledge that I am not what I give. I am not what I absorb. I am not what I survive. I am just a man who decided one Thursday in June that the rest of his life was going to be lived on his own terms. That's enough. That's more than enough.